everyone, welcome to CMC Conversations. I'm Parishi, a class of 26 at CMC, and today we'll be speaking with Bertha Tobias, who's a class of 24. Hi Bertha, welcome.
Hey Parishi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of
this
course.
is so cool.
Introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Bertha. I am a CMC junior, like Parishi mentioned, class of 24. I'm majoring in international relations with a sequence in leadership studies. On campus, I work in the admissions office. I absolutely love it. Shout out to the admissions office. I'm on the Hive student staff team, which is our center for design thinking and collaborative creativity at the 5Cs. I'm a student advisor for our Kravis Leadership Institute's Women in Leadership Development Program. So that's a mouthful. I love it. And I'm a student rep for our trustee board college advancement committee. So that's also pretty cool.
Awesome. So there's something that you've done over the summer that's really unique, which is producing your own TV show. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and how you as a college student have been able to create a TV show?
Yeah, so it's called Spotlight. It really came out of my passion for both entrepreneurship and television and media, and then not being able to find an internship that I thought would really capture what I wanted to learn. So I really wanted to throw myself into the deep end of something that I just didn't know and that I wasn't doing in school because I'm an IR major. So I thought, okay, the best time to do it is right now while I'm in school, because this is the time where like you can use other people's money and like, you know, like there's the people who are supporting you and you have a community that you can really take advantage of, especially at a school like CMC. So I applied for SIE funding, which is sponsored internships and experiences. I got funding from that and they were like, yeah, like go for it. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I went home, and the important technicality, I'm from Namibia. The important technicality is that the US dollar does go a really long way when you like take it to economies that aren't as developed. So it means that with funding from here, I was able to produce a really high quality show at home. So I did that. We tracked down some of my favorite Namibian entrepreneurs and we just profiled them, asked them a bunch of questions about their respective journeys, hung out with them, packaged it into a television show, and then gave it to Namibia's biggest broadcaster. I think it helped that we gave it to them for free because I was like, it's a great show and you get it for free. But now we have funding for a second season, which is pretty cool. So I'm looking forward to doing that over the summer.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of like a dream, like being able to just get money from your college to start your own TV show. And I'm sure it's also a really big learning experience because you get to talk to all these entrepreneurs. So talk me through, how do you actually identify who you want to speak with, and what's the process like leading up to the actual interview?
Yeah, so that's a great question. How do I identify them? I'll be honest, first of all, Namibia is a really small country, 2.5 million people, so it's really easy to spot sort of the big fish and to spot who's making a difference because there'll be reports about them, we're reading about them in the news, and the impact of their work is very visible. So I just looked at the most prolific, most notable young Namibian entrepreneurs, so that was sort of a pool that was kind of obvious. But as it relates to the specifics within that pool, I was very intentional about making sure that we had diversity in terms of the kinds of not the kinds of entrepreneurship, but the fields in which they were the fields in which they were pursuing entrepreneurial careers, essentially. So we had like retail, we had e-commerce, we had entrepreneurs in the food business, some in the cosmetics industry. We had a medical doctor who was a healthpreneur. We had a lot of like tech startups. So one of them is like essentially building the Amazon of Namibia. So there was a lot of range within the fields that they were associated with. That was one thing. And then also there was a range in terms of the formality of their entrepreneurial journey. So some people just had like food trailers, right? But they had like several food trailers across the country. And then some people were more into like institutional formal trade, like somebody who was manufacturing cream and lotion and like shampoo, which is a lot more part of the formal economy. So the big broad criteria was just, these are all my favorite entrepreneurs in any case, like I'm just a huge fan. And then the second thing was that diversity of field. And then the third thing would be the formality or the informality of the economies in which they were operating.
I see.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this probably gave you a really new perspective on your home. Like, you grew up in Namibia, you go to school there, but I don't think before college you're really looking at all the entrepreneurs around you so deeply.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you were able to learn a lot from that experience.
Yeah, I was. So specifically, it's interesting because I think I needed to leave Namibia to be able to be like, wow, we're kind of crushing it. Like, you guys are doing an amazing job. And so I went to high school in China, and that was really the first time where I started looking a lot at the role that young people play in driving a country forward, especially as it relates to innovation and technology. And I think that's just because in high school, I was surrounded by all of like these incredible, like, fellow students who were just crushing it, who were like really dedicated to the work that they were doing. And the high school that I went to, I will say, was a little bit like cutthroat. But I think it did give me an appreciation for people who are dedicated to solving problems in their respective countries. And then the natural thing for me to do was try to evaluate what young people at home are doing, and try to just tell those stories more positively. And then hopefully tell like more African stories that expand beyond Namibia. So yeah, it definitely gave me a greater appreciation. But I think it also just reminded me that like excellence or dedication towards solving complex challenges is something that's very universal, and it's not like specific to the West or to like developed countries.
So first off, I think removing yourself from an environment just gives you like a new outlook, and you kind of start to see things that you weren't looking at before.
Yeah.
So that's very insightful. And then you're talking about this general theme that goes beyond borders when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship. Can you go more in depth about what that actually is and what it really takes to go from a concept to actual execution?
Oh, that's such a good question. Wow. Let me think about that for a second. So I really think with innovation and entrepreneurship, what I'm learning, and this is what I love about entrepreneurship, I think what I'm learning is that there's a certain skill set that you cultivate from just throwing yourself into doing something. So I think what entrepreneurship exemplifies for me is that you can like just do, like you just go out in the world, you identify something that you want to solve, and then you just develop and design a unique mechanism by which you solve that problem. And I think that's the way I like to look at the world. I think entrepreneurship is creativity in motion, essentially. So I think that what not just successful entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship in general, I think what they're really good at doing is identifying a problem and you just go about solving it. And I think that's a skill set that's applicable to just everyday life, regardless of the job that you're doing, is being creative and trying to be unique in the problems that you're solving and in the solutions that you devise to those problems. So I think that's what I love about it, is really it encapsulates the fact that problem solving, in my opinion, should be creative, and that a solution should not be informed necessarily by like a standardized pre-existing criteria for how to solve a thing, but it should be unique to the specific situation that you're in. And I just think that that's useful in general, whether that's a conversation, whether it's an interaction, whether it's, like negotiating a salary increase. That's stuff that I think if you just study entrepreneurship very closely, you can just apply in general.
I think that's also just great advice for life, because if you have something that you want to tackle and you're really like set on the standard ways of tackling that problem, if you're really set on following those rules, you're going to find yourself feeling really restricted and very enclosed. But if you kind of forget those old ways of thinking and you start rethinking and you start reanalyzing the situation and kind of trusting yourself to come up with your own strategies, I think you can solve problems in a very unique way that's effective for you, because you're kind of staying true to yourself. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really cool general theme that you pointed out, but you do really focus on entrepreneurship in Namibia. From what you know about entrepreneurship in general, what would you say is unique in Namibia's environment for innovation?
So what's unique about it, and I'll say this, is not even okay. So there's a positive uniqueness and a negative uniqueness. I think what's negatively unique about entrepreneurship in the developing world in general is the fact that a lot of the systems and structures that should be enabling people to just enjoy a higher quality of life in general aren't there. So when you're trying to solve a complex problem in the developing world, you kind of need to build the mechanisms that are supposed to support the solution that you're trying to implement. So for instance, if you are building a tech company, so there's a very rapidly growing tech startup in Namibia, actually. It's called Jabu Logistics. And what they do is essentially a business-to-business e-commerce platform. So they're like Amazon, but for companies. So for instance, they help deliver stock inventories and stuff. Doesn't matter. The point is they needed to actually build roads in some of the places that they were serving because the roads didn't exist. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of African entrepreneurs will have, is that sometimes you're trying to solve a problem and it's really noble, but even the systems that are supposed to help you, that are supposed to support you essentially solve that problem, don't exist. So when you're designing your entrepreneurial model or journey, you're not only thinking about building a successful tech company, but you're also thinking, do people have smartphones? Do people have like electricity? Do they have, roads? Which is not something that you'd have to consider here, where many people already have that. So I think that's the negative uniqueness. But I think on the flip side of that is that you're forced to be a lot more creative, and you're forced to be a lot more, original and innovative about the way that you're solving problems, because like the environment is just not enabling enough. So you kind of have to create those conditions. So I think that's what's different, is that it really does require a lot more from you in terms of the wider scope of what you're thinking about. And I think that's the key difference, is in the developed world, you can go, it's like go deep versus go wide. You can really go deep when you are like in Silicon Valley, for instance. You're solving a very specific problem. If you're like launching an AI platform, you don't have to worry about whether people have access to the internet. Whereas at home, it's more like go wide, in the sense that, okay, you're launching something, but do people have smartphones? And if they don't, how do you solve that? So I think that's the biggest contrast that I've observed.
That's very interesting. So it seems like you take a playing field, and in these developing countries, the playing field is not as level as it would be in more developed countries. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to build it out yourself. You have to really flesh out the entire space.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the idea of building a road to deliver products to people, an extension of that is you're just building a road, and that's a net benefit to society. So would you say that entrepreneurship in Namibia has unique benefits to society that it wouldn't have in other countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's exactly it, right? So I think in addition to what I've already said about how you just need to be more creative in general, the net benefit is that you would also have to double as a social entrepreneur, even if that's not what you had essentially set out to do. And that's another key distinction, actually, that I've learned at CMC, is the fact that obviously there's different types of entrepreneurship. There's social entrepreneurship, and, just how we were saying, like I took that class with Gemma on social innovation and startups, and how there are many different models. And I think if you're just setting out, for instance, to be a for-profit entrepreneur in Namibia, you would likely end up, especially if you're in a field like logistics or energy, you'd likely end up also as a social entrepreneur, just because of the net social benefits that you've pointed out. So definitely.
That's very interesting. So you have to be a social entrepreneur, mm-hmm. and you also have to market your product to people, run the whole business itself, and make sure that you're getting a profit.
Yeah.
So these smaller businesses that are startups in the country, do they often come at odds with bigger corporations in terms of price matching, marketing, and just catering to the population?
Yeah, like definitely. They would come at odds. That's super, it's very natural that they would be at odds. And just because they're obviously like competing against companies that have been existing for a very long time. I think what's super interesting even in a country like Namibia is that a lot of, and I'm so glad you asked that question, so a lot of huge corporations have been around for years. Like they're like essentially colonial, you know what I mean? They have like a colonial history. And that's not to place a value judgment on the work that they're doing. Some of these companies are crushing it and contributing significantly to the Namibian economy. But in terms of their structural origins, a lot of smaller emerging businesses don't really stand a chance, to be quite frank. And that's not because they're not good, but it's because bigger companies have just had literally like tens of years of a head start. And not just that, but I think a lot of it has to do with the education and the skill set that a lot of young Namibians have had access to. So something that I think, and as an IR major, I definitely get to have the privilege of looking at the intersections between policy, for instance, and entrepreneurship, or policy and business, and just looking for links. And what I've experienced and seen is that there's also a lot of historical reasons for why Black young entrepreneurs specifically would struggle. So for instance, one of the most damaging pieces of legislation from the colonial era in Namibia is the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which just basically, in summary, meant that a lot of Black Namibian schools were underfunded, while white schools were funded by the colonial government, essentially. And that had huge implications that persist until today for the quality and the level of education that a lot of people have access to, and there's that discrepancy. So even just in terms of the skill set that young Black Namibian entrepreneurs specifically are able to access, that's a challenge, like going to school. Because I think what I've also learned with entrepreneurship is that it's not just like you wake up one day and you're like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, and you roll out of bed and you do it. Like, you need to learn. And that's why some of the most successful entrepreneurs had quote unquote real jobs before they went into entrepreneurship. Like, they worked at big corporations, because there is a value to be derived from that also before you go out and try to build something in the world. So that's definitely one of the biggest clashes I'm seeing, is that bigger companies in Namibia have just had a head start, but also a lot of them happen to be white owned. And that's okay. But that also does also mean that as it relates to skill set and size and time frame, they're definitely leading the race, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they have the advantage of resources, sophisticated governance boards, like so much money, so much like global presence. And it seems almost impossible that small companies can come at odds with them and actually make a statement and make a significant impact in the economy. So I'm wondering, how do they maintain success, and how do they actually come out on top given this type of environment?
Yeah. So how do the small businesses maintain success?
Yeah.
So I guess that would depend on how the respective ventures would define success, right? So part of my criteria for finding entrepreneurs were, one, they're the ones who are like most popular and like super cool and crushing it. But I was also trying to look at just which ones had the most impact that was sort of tangible, and whether that's impact just in terms of like inspiring hope within their specific communities, whether that's impact in terms of being strategically located in certain places where they're able to cater to people who wouldn't have access, to their services, for instance. So one of the entrepreneurs we interviewed was a woman who runs a cuisine, like a local traditional cuisine place called Sai's Kitchen. But what was unique about her business was that she's set up in an informal settlement, essentially, almost like a shanty town, where people wouldn't be able to access like restaurant quality food. And that's where she runs her business, and that's where she's chosen to stay, despite having enough clout and momentum and growth to move to like the central business district or the city center. So I think it also depends on, how they measure success. I think she measures success in that way, and she's absolutely crushing it. So I guess in that way, if you rely on your contextual considerations of success, then you can measure success in that way. But the other thing though is also just, again, it takes me back to just the opportunities that you've been exposed to, right? I think the only reason, for instance, I've been able to make Spotlight is because I go to CMC, and because I'm very well supported and very well cushioned, and I have the privilege to be like, what do I want to do with my summer? And I can do this, and it's not something that I'm paying for. So even that has a lot to do with your success is also definitely the people around you and the resources that you have. And if you don't have those, it's tough. Yeah.
I think a fallacy is just assuming that the success of a company is just its profitability. It's also the impact that you're making, the social change that you're bringing about. And that example that you gave about the small restaurant, I mean, it really is about where you're positioning yourself and being very smart about that. And I'm wondering, like, if in Namibia there is a general movement towards supporting small businesses and local entrepreneurs rather than buying from these larger corporations.
Well, I wouldn't. No, no. Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, it's not like there's a strong sort of campaign, I think, towards like small and local businesses. I think it's just a regular like capitalist business environment, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think, especially, and this also just brings me back to my my CMC education, and this might be a little bit of a hot take. So CMC is like Latin, like one of their unofficial mottos is how civilization prospers through commerce. And I think there's, even in my classes, to be quite frank, I've seen an emphasis on the wisdom of the market and like the wisdom of market forces. And that theory is kind of growing on me a little bit. I'm like, yeah, I get it. So I think there's no movement towards supporting small businesses in particular. The way I see it, small businesses are part of market forces, and they, it's like a competitive business environment, and they work within the environment that they have. So I don't see a force trying to change that, and quite frankly, I don't think there should be.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you think there shouldn't be?
Because I think small businesses obviously need support, and they need structures, and they need an enabling environment. But part of an enabling environment, I think, is economic competition. I think that's what drives productivity and innovation, is people having the incentive to not only be efficient in the way they allocate their resources, but also people having the incentive to be the best that they can be. But that competition doesn't mean that they shouldn't have support. I think they absolutely should. But I think that support can coexist with market forces.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because
it's also a very CMC thing to say.
I know, but it is an interesting take, because like the trust in the market forces and the trust that small businesses will also have their place in the game, I think that can stand a lot of the time. But in the case of a monopoly, so let's say that one large corporation is hogging up an entire industry, and small businesses are trying to prosper, but they keep on getting bogged down by their low prices and their domination. Do you think that there should be any sort of support or social movement towards supporting the small businesses and dismantling that monopoly?
Yeah, so monopolies are a market failure, right? So I think what I'm saying is, I think market forces work when, like you pointed out, they're governed efficiently by, credible institutions, but monopolies aren't a result. Monopolies are a sign of an inefficiency, right? There's an accrual of excessive profits by one person. So that's not a sign of a wise economic market, in my opinion. And I'm not like an economist, like like guru or whatever. But I don't think that a wise market essentially is characterized by monopolies. Like, they exist, but again, those are inefficiencies. That's a type of market failure. And yes, there definitely should be that kind of regulation. So the way I see it, just to bring it back to like a more sort of ground level, is actually, this is a great analogy. I think the way I see it is really sort of, small businesses need to be supported, but that support shouldn't erase their autonomy and their independence and undermine their capacity to compete in a market. And I think that's the point of support, is so that they're able to compete properly, right? The way I see it is also kind of, with going to school here at CMC, right? I would be the small business, right? Coming from like this small developing country where I wouldn't generally have the resources that I would need to thrive to my fullest potential. And I would have the support that I have from like financial aid, from all the donors who are being super cool and making my education here possible. I would be the small business in that situation that's being supported to thrive in the market being CMC. So that's really the way I see it. But that support and me being able to be here doesn't mean that the market forces, aka CMC, aka students who've already had access to these opportunities their entire lives, should be eliminated or should be less supported. I think because the point of that support is so that I'm able to like thrive here. And that's really the way I see small businesses also, is we prop them up so that they can work in like the conventional economy, and not prop them up and then erase the conventional economy, that kind of that renders the support redundant, because where would they sort of participate? So I don't know about like a social movement as such, but I definitely think that supporting small businesses and market forces are not mutually exclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that really cleared that up.
Okay.
I mean, what you're getting to is that they should be empowered, but also maintain their agency.
Yeah,
and not
100%.
so supported that they are stifled, or that the entire shape of the market starts to shift.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Going back to the conversations that you've had with entrepreneurs in Namibia, what are some interesting moments or just topics that really stood out to you, people that really stood out to you?
Wow, that's a good one. They all were so awesome. I think someone that really stood out was, let me see, Eno Amambo. So he owns like a growing hot dog chain, essentially. And he was a professional dancer for a really long time, a struggling professional dancer. And he was just in a really dark place in his life, and he needed something to do, and he like loved hot dogs. So he started researching how to make hot dogs. And now what Dibangos, that's his food chain, or his food business, Dibangos is famous for just having really random hot dog combinations, like pineapples on sausage, or like something called the secret iPhone sauce. Like it's like an experience. It's like a funky, fun experience. It's almost like the Subway of Namibia now. And he's absolutely crushing it. And I think the reason that stood out for me was because he had no prior formal experience in the food business or in catering or hospitality. I mean, he was a dancer, but he just jumped ship and he went into that. But I think what also stood out is that he spoke a lot about mental health also. And I think that's something that never really comes up when we talk about entrepreneurship, because I think, at least when I think of entrepreneurs, I think of like grind, hustle, go. And there's never a lot of room for in the conversation about what are the mental health structures that might be uniquely designed for entrepreneurs to support them, because they're very unique challenges. And that's why like right now, for instance, Josh Walters, who's like super awesome, he started like this group essentially of young students at the 5Cs who are solving problems and whose sort of solutions are very outward facing. So these are like, it's a group of us. So there's students in like public policy, there's students in like social entrepreneurship who are working towards solving the water crisis. But the point is, we come together and we talk about like what we're experiencing, right? Like in terms of leadership. But what I found, and just linking it back to Aino, is that that's been so helpful for me to come and have a space to nurture and nourish my mental health as somebody who is kind of like just creating a niche path, not niche, but like just a path that doesn't feel conventional and is not super reflected in like recruiting for internships, for instance. So the reason that specific interview with Aino stood out for me was not only because he pivoted to a thing where he didn't have experience, which is what I feel like I'm doing right now, but it's also because he spoke about the mental health challenges that come with that pivot, where traditional systems of support don't really exist.
So Aino's case kind of shows what you were talking about earlier, that a lack of experience and a lack of knowledge can at times be an asset for you to not really know the rules and kind of go into it and just make it your own thing. And he didn't have any experience in the food industry, and he was able to create this really cool hot dog chain that's very creative and very exciting. And then I think that lack of experience in the entrepreneurship field, and that being new to this space and kind of observing, oh wow, okay, being too focused on this is taking a toll on my mental health. It's important to step back and think about, how is this affecting me? I think that's also a really interesting take, because when you're just continuing to hustle and when you're continuing to produce an output, it's easy to forget about how it's actually affecting you as a person rather than as somebody who's just working. So really glad that you pointed that out. So I want to know, when it comes to creating that balance for yourself, because creating Spotlight is honestly an entrepreneurship project in and of itself. How have you been able to find that over time, and what do you hope to learn and produce that you weren't able to do before in your second season?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll answer the first one first. with creating that balance, honestly, I think I'm still trying to find that balance. But it really, so I think I've divided my world up into two sections. There's like the formal world where I'm doing school and like writing thesis and being a student. And then there's the second world, which is like spotlight and, like hobbies and like a passion of mine. And it's been very helpful for me to compartmentalize those and that's why I also kind of almost refuse to like bring the two worlds together, because then that would just be overwhelming. So that compartmentalization I found oddly comforting. It's given me a certain sense of order that has made it feel more manageable, and like I can break things down into chunks. What is very helpful is honestly, and I'm not just saying this because there's CMC conversations, but it's honestly having a really great like fallback, right? Like, so for me, Spotlight is like, oh my gosh, I think I'm going to do this thing. I love this. But at the same time, I'm also applying to grad school, and I'm surrounded by all of these amazing people who are solving really difficult problems, and students who are CMC students, some of the most driven people I've ever met in my life. I'll just say that. But, students who are super driven, who are super committed to making the world a better place. And it's really cool to be insulated by that. Like, I feel safe, to be quite frank. And I think that makes it easier. It makes, because I'm like, well, if Spotlight fails, or like if I just have like a failed TV career, like I'm fine. Like, I'm going to go to grad school and get a great job. And that's genuinely how I feel. And I think that has made it less overwhelming, is being lucky enough to be here and being safe, essentially. That's the true answer. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
I was asking about how what you've learned can be applied for your second season.
I think what I've learned is more like certain skills more than like specific technical applications. So I think a huge skill that I'm learning is that you don't know until you just do. Like, I think many times, and Will Smith writes about this in his autobiography, which is one of my favorite books ever, and he says, no paralysis through analysis, essentially, which is just this idea that many times we are paralyzed by, analyzing and researching, and it's essentially a procrastination method sometimes, when we're like, I have to know everything before I do this thing. Like, I need to know A, B, C, D, E, and I need to know every single thing before I embark on this thing. But sometimes, like, that's really a type of self-deception where it's just like, no, you don't really need to know that. Like, you just need to do the thing and then learn what to do and what not to do. So I think that's what I've learned, is that you don't know until you just do, and that's what I'm applying in my second season. So instead of being like, oh, but I need to talk to this person and this person and this person first before I produce a second season so I can have like a different broadcasting partner, is like, just do, and then whatever needs to happen will find you. Like, you should just be found doing, like, just be found using what you have and doing the best that you can with what you have. And I think that momentum is what invites whatever's going to propel you to the next stage of whatever you're doing.
Just go in with confidence that you can do it. And
I don't even know about the confidence. Like, I don't even know. Because I think if you're doing something that you don't know, by design, you're probably not going to be very confident. Like, I think even when I was making Spotlight, I wasn't very confident. I think right now I'm still kind of like, ooh. And so I actually think not having confidence while you're doing the thing keeps you on your toes.
I mean, I guess that keeps you humble.
Yeah.
I was thinking it's along the lines of fake it till you make it, but also know that you're faking it in some ways, and just 100%. Being like open to knowledge. You know? That's really interesting. So, I mean, just talking about entrepreneurship with you taught me a lot of things about how to approach something I'm unfamiliar with. Like a space where there's a lot of competition, who's going to actually come out on top? What does success mean? And that was just like a lot of insight that you got from just talking about this one field of work, entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's so much to learn when you apply yourself to something new. So I just want to say I really appreciate you sharing all these new things with me, and giving us a look into what it's like to create a TV show and to really throw yourself into something you've never done before.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah. You're crushing it with CMC Conversations.
Really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're doing such a good job. Yeah.
Well, it was great having you, Bertha, and thank you for watching CMC Conversations. See you next time.